All right, everybody. So thank you very much for joining me in this third webinar of the session of the year. This one will be about assessing vocabulary, and I do have a lot of questions that I want to pose and discuss with you about this topic, because I feel like a lot of times we talk about in terms there's a lot more focus on assessment like assessing listening, assessing reading, assessing writing, assessing speaking, assessing the separate skills, right? But we not often very much talk about assessing vocabulary per se, just vocabulary. So I do have a lot of things that I want to point out and then that I want to discuss today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And today's webinar, so it's assessing vocabulary. This is, like I said, the third of our series this year. And I couldn't help myself. I had to pick up a photo of a dictionary because I feel like that's what we think about when we think about words. We think about dictionaries and old-fashioned, I guess, as well. Today's webinar is sponsored by Istituto Americano. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce this in Italian as well as I should be able to. It's a language center. It's one of the leading American language centers in Italy, and it offers training not only of American English, but also culture as well. And it offers teacher training to prospective EFL teachers. So I encourage you to check it out. They all have a lot of resources as well. So thank you to the American Language Center in Italy for sponsoring this webinar. All right, so I have to confess, I am very old-fashioned, and when I think of vocabulary, I think of Reader's Digest, and I think of it pays to increase your word power. I don't know how familiar with that you are with this magazine. I don't particularly like the way it is now, like the current issues, but I grew up reading my grandma's magazines and trying both in English and in Portuguese. And I remember loving reading this magazine, the little articles. That's how I actually improved my English a lot, was by reading Reader's Digest in English. And one of my favorite parts was the word power vocabulary, and it prays to increase your word power. So I often found it very difficult, and I think it's designed to be very difficult, but I thought it would be a good idea to like bring this up as a warm up for our webinar this session, because it's a very common vocabulary task, right? You give a word and then you have definitions, right? But for a lot of reasons, this type of task is particularly hard, right? And so what I want you to be thinking throughout the vocabulary, this webinar, is to think about what kind of tasks facilitate assessment of vocabulary, what kind of tasks hinder assessment vocabulary, what kind of tasks are better depending on the purpose of your vocabulary test, right? Just a quick question before I move on. Are you guys familiar with this? Have you ever read Reader's Digest, and did you ever take those quizzes to improve your vocabulary?
Yeah, I knew it as a child.
And did you take these quizzes in English as well to like just learn new words or see how much you knew?
Yes.
Yeah. Chris, did you read that in Portuguese too?
I'm familiar with it. Yes, I hadn't seen it in a while, but yes, I remember growing up as a child as well. And, you know, whenever I was trying to learn some vocabulary and languages at all, like I remember seeing that before. It's kind of nice to see it again.
I loved it. Yeah, I love like old-fashioned like Reader Digest issues, right? The old ones, like this one is 1952. That's the ones that I usually read when I was growing up back at home. So, but really crazy vocabulary too, which was really good, and you could always test yourself. Like, I'm the kind of person that likes taking quizzes. I don't know if you all are. Maybe you're interested in assessment as well, so you're all like me. You like taking quizzes just for fun. All right, so keeping in mind with the Reader's Digest theme, one of the sections was points to ponder, right? And so I sent you a few questions in the original email, in the original message that said questions to ponder, questions to reflect before the webinar. And so these are things that I thought it would be interesting to discuss today and cover within different ranges of the assessment and teaching of vocabulary. So I asked prior to the webinar that you think about how you yourself assess vocabulary, right? What kind of tasks you use, how often do you assess vocabulary knowledge, and why do you assess vocabulary knowledge? So before we actually delve into those questions and talk about these issues, is there anything in particular that you thought when you thought about these questions before the webinar that you would like to share now? For example, what kind of tasks do you use? Do you use a variety of tasks, or do you stick to one type of task? So really briefly, let's have a short discussion here on the answers, about the answers to these questions.
I don't teach intensive English anymore. You know, I'm a director, and so I observe my teachers, and I also teach a class in assessment, in ESL assessment. But what I used to do as a teacher, and what we talk about in class, and what I see my other teachers doing, you know, it depends on the skill level. You know, beginning, intermediate, and advanced, if you will. But you know, I've used closed tests. I've used modified closed tests where there's a word bank and then they have to choose, you know, I've also simply matching, you know, and I've also, in addition to assessing, to encourage students, I encourage students to kind of do the old fashioned flashcard thing where they're writing the word on one side and definition on the other. Some of them kind of look at me like I'm crazy, but I think it's still a very effective tool for helping students to, you know, begin to internalize the surface level of the vocabulary. You know, you need to do a lot more work to make sure that it sticks and that you begin to learn those nuances. But in terms of just memorization, I think those flashcards are still quite effective.
And it's self-assessment, right? They can test themselves. Yeah. Excellent. Any other comments about like why you assess vocabulary knowledge? Why?
It's the very essence of language. I mean, we
Yeah.
don't have vocabulary. We don't have.
Yeah. I also think that you want to know how much students know. So I kind of share the same feelings as Michael. I haven't taught in a long time, but I remember when I used to be a director for ELS, one of the things, the resources that they like to use at the time was Quizlet. I don't know if you guys, did you guys get to see Quizlet? When he said flashcards, it immediately came to my mind how students had fun with being able to have visual resources like the flashcards, the cloze exercises as well, or anything that they could refer with interaction, audio, and you know, anything that was like more visual for them as well. So yeah, and I remember the students liked it, teachers liked it a lot as well, and it was effective for them. So that was good.
Do you have a feeling that in general students enjoy learning vocabulary and being tested on their vocabulary knowledge?
Depends on the student.
Depends on the student.
And it depends on the way of testing too. I think just to be the the odd one out here. So Michael and Chris were both talking about Quizlet, lists of words, this sort of thing, and I actually tend to try to avoid that. I mean, I'm not talking about learning, but I'm actually talking about assessing here. I always try to assess vocabulary in context and never in isolation. That's just my feeling about how it should be assessed, which is not the same as how it should be learned. But and you know, in addition to like the way I would test vocabulary, of course, there are published assessments that come with some textbooks that will do it in a very different way. So sometimes I have to do, I have to assess it in the way that a commercial test has come to us, but it's not my way, just to say.
Michael, I think I would agree with you. I like testing words a lot better in vocabulary and also giving students words for students to learn in context as well, because better than just like an alphabetical order list. But I think there's a place for both in terms of assessment and teaching and learning as well. So we will talk about these. This is the first thing that actually we're going to discuss. What is vocabulary knowledge and what does it mean to know a word? So I'm not going to get too deep into this one right now, because I think that is the very essence of being able to construct a test that will assess vocabulary, right? Because if you don't define your construct, what is it that it means to know a word or to use a word? How are you going to prepare your test? So I think that question number 2 is the essence of being able, is like the first thing that you have to come to terms with, and then work within like you as a teacher and with the students themselves in order to prepare your assessments, right? Define the construct. What does it mean, right? And the third question is also one that I'm very interested in finding out what your thoughts are, because usually we see vocabulary as usually vocabulary questions, right? Usually appear in reading assessments, and you're usually linking vocabulary to written production, right? So the last thing that we're going to discuss today is this idea of testing vocabulary within, for example, speech tasks, right? Or other types of tasks that are not only, or tests that are not only reading tests or writing tests. So I want to know your thoughts when we get there about do you think if this in fact is a limitation, if we should expand to other tests as well, right? So we'll get there. All right, so I think the first thing that we need to talk about or bring up, and I think this is something that in your comments about the previous slide, you already brought this up in a way, is that we have to think about what it means to like learn a language or to acquire a language, right? And not because these are different processes, right? So learning and acquiring a language, and also learning and acquiring vocabulary, right? What comes naturally and what comes as a conscious effort on the part of the students. So we have to keep this in mind in order to think about, 1, teaching vocabulary, and 2, assessing the vocabulary that we are teaching, right? So we have to think in terms of natural acquisition of words that happens naturally as they are learning a second language, but also the words that are taught them or that they actually learn as part of a conscious effort that they make to learn and to increase their vocabulary knowledge, right? So I think that is also very much linked to how we assess and why we assess, right? So if we're thinking that if it's just learned naturally, then what are we going to assess, right? But if we're teaching specifically vocabulary, then we need to assess the achievement of learning of those words that we're teaching students, right? So we have to think about it when we think about assessing vocabulary. And thinking about this idea of like what happens naturally and what is actually or should be taught, right? We all know, and if we speak in other languages as well, that even at an advanced level, we have the feeling that we are maybe lacking vocabulary to express concepts and ideas that we can express in our mother tongue, but we can't express in the second language. So I think this is one of the reasons why we need vocabulary teaching is very important, right? We need not to just hope for the best and hope that vocabulary learning will happen naturally while you're teaching other skills, right? I think that there is an importance in placing into teaching vocabulary and in assessing vocabulary, because one of the things that I've read a lot about assessment is that the message that we send to students when we don't assess things that we've taught, right? So by teaching vocabulary and then assessing the vocabulary, we're telling them, yes, this is important, focus on this will increase your vocabulary knowledge, right? So things that we have to consider is how much time we devote to regular conscious teaching of vocabulary, as well as regular conscious assessment of vocabulary when we teach, right? And not just expect that it will happen naturally. It will happen naturally, a lot of learning, yes, but I think it's important to help students learn and improve their vocabulary knowledge, right? But talking about vocabulary knowledge, right? It is an integral part to overall second language ability. And that was what Michael Schwartz said in the very beginning, right? It's the building blocks, right? And so therefore we have to think about teaching and assessing vocabulary, just like we teach grammar and we assess grammar, or we teach speaking and we assess speaking skills, right? And so on and so forth. So I think the main points that we have to consider as we were talking about assessing is, what does it mean to know a word? What does it mean to teach a word, right? What does it mean to learn a word? And what are the implications of all of that to assessing word knowledge, right? And that will be our way to define our construct when we are designing our vocabulary assessments, right? Whether the vocabulary assessment is a vocabulary assessment in itself, is just a test of vocabulary, or whether that vocabulary assessment is part of a bigger assessment, right? Is a more communicative task. So it's not the main focus, but it's part of it, right? So what does it mean to know a word? So before I show you my points here, what does it mean to know a word? What do you know when you know a word? Chris?
I think it depends. That question right now made me think deeply about if you're thinking as a teacher or if you're thinking as a student. Okay. I think if you're thinking as a teacher, when you're teaching a word, you want to make sure that you know all the variations, not all the variations, but at least as a foreigner teacher, at least, you know, you have enough knowledge to be able to teach the student, right? And achieve your purpose. But I think when a student thinks about, I know a word, he's thinking separately. Okay, I know a certain specific word, but not the variations of that word. And sometimes as the students start to progress in their language learning, you know, it is something that it's challenging for them, you know, okay, you have one single word, but for that word, you have so many other variations, and it gets so complicated to use all those variations with the grammar structures and in an advanced proficient conversation with somebody else as well. So that's what I was thinking. What do you guys think?
That's a great, let me just make a comment on that. I think it's a great point to think of what does it mean for the student and what does it mean for the teacher? And as teachers, do we tell the students what it actually means to know a word? Do we talk about all these different things that you talked about? Do we convey that to them, right? And so I think this is something to think about. The other Michaels, do you have any thoughts on this? What does it mean to know a word?
Well, I think, you know, I would include the denotation, connotations, the word family, right? So different forms of the word. And even if you're teaching the basic word, is it, what part of speech is it? I would also include collocations. And then just further, and I'll just give you an example from something that happened to me just today, just essentially how that word is actually used, in what context. For example, I had a French speaker today who was talking about television diffusion. I knew exactly what she meant. I speak French too, but I knew exactly what she meant. She meant broadcast. And why don't we say diffusion of television? Well, we just don't. And we can diffuse, in English, we can diffuse a situation, or we might diffuse a crowd after a riot or something like this. But we don't diffuse radio and television. We have a different word for that. So although it seems to be just the right word, it just doesn't work that way in English language. So I think sort of getting the feel of just how you can actually use this word is, I think all of those are parts of knowing what a word is. And of course, a translation. Knowing a translation is also part of knowing a word.
I would also say the phonetics or the pronunciation of the word. You know,
definitely. So
in addition to everything else. Yeah.
Definitely. So Nation, I believe in 1990, I'll have to check here, compiled a list of what it means to know a word, right? So the meaning, right? The meanings. Usually words have multiple meanings, right? And like Michael was saying, denotation and connotation as well. The written form, what is it? How does it spelled? The spoken form, what does it sound like? How is it pronounced? The grammatical behavior, in what patterns does it occur, right? Collocations, what words come after or before, right? I usually talk to my students about, like, to explain collocations, like, oh, why do we say fast food and not quick food? Why do we say yellow hair and not blonde? Well, why do we say blonde hair and not yellow hair, right? Why do we say quick shower but not fast shower, right? And so we have, when we learn a word, we need to learn the words that come along with it, right? The register, is the word formal or informal? I feel like this one is very much neglected when we teach vocabulary, right? Sometimes you hear students will use a word, and I remember this, I can't remember exactly, oh, I remember exactly the word, what the word was. I was in college, and then my oral communications professor at college, she said, I used the word profound when I should have used the word deep, because I was talking about depth in terms of like a pool depth or something like that, more physical. And I used the word profound because in Portuguese is the same word, right? For like depth in meaning, like it's, oh, this was profound, or like metaphorically speaking, or the physical thing. And she said, and she took me so many, she took points off because I used the word profound and I should have used the word deep, right? Which in Brazil, it means exactly the same thing. And so I think we need to talk about register, if the word is used formally or informally, where you can expect to hear it from whom, right? Who would most likely use that word, and associations with that word. How does it relate with to other words, right? What other words could be used in place of that one in terms of like synonyms or words that have similar meanings as well, right? And a lot of the things, a lot of the vocabulary tests, we are usually looking as well at frequency, right? We're talking about low frequency words versus high frequency words. That's something that you hear a lot when you're talking about vocabulary assessment. So thinking about what Chris said about students, what do students think when they say, oh, I know this word, right? But do you really? Like, do you really know this word? And though I think it's very important when we're teaching students that they learn, or that they realize, actually not that learn, but they realize that there's so many dimensions to learning a word without scaring them. Because if you think about it, like there's a lot to learn for each word, right? And so when we design our assessments, we have to think about which dimensions are we looking at? Are we testing just if they know how to spell the word? Are we testing just if they know how to pronounce the word, right? Are we testing if they know, for example, make and do, right? Do they know which words correlate with make and which words correlate with do, right? So we have to think about what exactly we want to test, what dimensions of that vocabulary knowledge we want to test, if all of them or if just parts of like each individual dimension, right? So we have to have this very clear in our heads when we are preparing our tests, but also when we are teaching students as well, right? Because you may be teaching something to the student about that word, if you're consciously teaching that word, and then if you're testing them in another dimension that you didn't explain, right, then your test is not congruent with your teaching as well. So we have to keep all these dimensions in mind, especially when we're writing test questions, because I feel like writing vocabulary questions are super hard to write, like distractors and being able to write good test items, right? So we have to keep in mind what exactly it is that we are testing. In the Brana Bakery Rama chapter that I shared with you, there was, so Richards also came up with like the assumptions of what it means to know a word, and it's very much related to what my previous slide. So this is also in the chapter that I shared with you. So what does it mean to know a word? And it's basically pretty much saying exactly the same thing, right? The syntactic behavior, so the grammar, the associations, the semantic value, the pragmatic value, the connotation, the denotation, right? So there's a lot to know about a word. And when we're talking about vocabulary in general, right, we have to think about our students' vocabulary depth, or another word for this would be the quality of their vocabulary. So how well they know all these aspects that I just mentioned about each word, right? But we also have to talk about vocabulary breadth, like the size of their vocabulary, right? How many words they know, right? And we also have to think about receptive knowledge versus productive knowledge. Being able to recognize a word is not the same thing as being able to produce that word later, for example. So if you give a fill in the blanks exercise and you ask the students to select a word to put there, or if you ask students to recognize if they know the meaning of that word, it's very different from them being able to actually produce a sentence with that word, right? And we want to be testing both. We want to be testing receptive knowledge as well as productive knowledge of vocabulary in a second language, right? Any comments so far? You were good?
I want to bring up, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you for the email about the daytime change, because I was like, okay, I missed the webinar, but then I got your email. Thank you. I just finished like a meeting and immediately joined the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Abdul Samad.
You're
Well,
welcome. And
thank you for joining us.
oh, it's my pleasure always to show up to the webinar because I learn a lot. So just to add about like the list of what it means to know a vocabulary, I see that on a spectrum, because for me as a student, if I'm learning that for the first time, especially when we are talking about like basic, lower levels, and then going into intermediate levels, I might not need a lot of variations. For example, like the collocations, I might need like a specific limited collocations to function while I'm learning. So I see the entire list as an ultimate goal that's going through a process. I might be like mastering all of those like for 2 or 3 words. But for another word, I'm still like on 4 or 2 of those. And it depends also on the use, the frequency. If I'm using that very much like in my writing and my speaking, if I need that like very often, then that will kind of determine to what extent I need it. But then, like some vocabularies now, if you ask me, I don't know, like their parts of speech. They're very important, yes. But because the way I use them, my need as a learner, as a speaker in using them might not be at that stage yet. So I don't need to know much of the list. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not one size fits all. That's how I see it as a learner, but also as a teacher.
And I would totally agree with you, Abdul Samad. And I also think that that plays a lot into how we test our students, right? We want to test the dimensions that they need at that point, right? We don't want to test them in dimensions that they do not need or they cannot grasp at that moment in time while they're learning, right? So I totally agree. Thank you, definitely. All right, so let's keep going here. Okay. So other considerations to keep in mind, right? When we're thinking about words, right? What counts as a word? Is first of all, 1 word or 3, right? Differently. 1 word or actually 3, sorry, or just 3, not 4. How many words do we count for gross, as in gross national product and gross like disgusting food, right? Is it only considered as 1 or, and here because it's an adjective 2, right? How about phrasal verbs like put up with or idioms like against the clock, right? How about proper names? How about words associated with French cooking, Japanese martial arts, or borrowed words from other languages that are used in English, right? And this is my favorite because it is related to grammar. How about present as a noun, right? And present as a verb, those 2 syllable words that can be both a noun and a verb. And I love teaching that when I'm teaching grammar to my students, is that grammar will affect your pronunciation. And they're like, what? Yes, it will affect your pronunciation of vocabulary words, right? And so we have to consider all of these things when we're thinking about teaching vocabulary, right? And we also when we are assessing our vocabulary tests, right? And we have to think that usually, and Michael mentioned before the commercial textbooks, right? Usually we're looking at meaning of particular content words, right? Is that your experience as well? With a lot of vocabulary tests, we look at just the meaning of those words selected from a list, right? But is this the best way to approach vocabulary? Or better yet, is this the only way to approach testing vocabulary, right? So we have to think about it in terms of word families, right? We have to think about in terms of function words and content words, especially if we're thinking about frequency, right? So for example, the articles, the, and a, right? These are function words, but they are not, and I think like, I'm just thinking about articles because it was brought up today in my class. And I think articles and prepositions, as a non-native speaker, you don't really have a feeling for them to know when to use them correctly or not. So it's important to be taught, and it's important to be tested as well, right? Even though they are function words and not usually the target of vocabulary tests. Phrasal verbs, compound nouns, right? Idioms as well, and formulaic language, right? Lexical phrases, like for example, so to speak, right? Do you test that? Do you teach that to your students, right? So in conventional tests, we're only usually looking, for the most part, at single words, right? As opposed to larger lexical items. And why is that? Why do you think that is the case? Why do we a lot of times focus on single words as opposed to larger lexical items? And has this been your experience as well? And what do you think of you as a teacher? Do you usually go for larger lexical items as well? Michael?
I would think it's because of the dictionary, going back, you have that denotation, here's the word, here's the definition, and, kind of leaving the student up to letting them or asking them to, learn the collocations, if you will, because there aren't those direct definitions, those direct links. I'm just kind of spitballing here. I really don't know why, but that's why I'm here.
Definitely, it goes back to the dictionary and how we learned words back in the day, right? How we taught words too. Chris?
I'm not sure. Yeah, that was a very good question. And that's the very first time in my life I'm thinking about that. So thank you for bringing that up. But I think I kind of agree a little bit with what Michael said. I think when the student is like a beginner, an intermediate, he needs like more directions, instructions from the teacher. But as people grow more fluent and proficient in their language learning, they tend to be able to study things more on their own or learn certain phrases and sentences on their own. And let me give you an example. I don't teach anymore. I don't work as a director at a language school, but at ITAB, we tend to see all these tests coming in all the time. And let me tell you, sometimes we will have our writing sections, and the students will have this perfect lexical sentences, and they're beautiful worded. But then when it gets to the speaking section, they can't put that sentence together. So sometimes I think that also as they grow more advanced, they study on their own, they memorize. There's a lot of memorization as well, and students, they are able to put that in their writing in a nice sample. But sometimes when they have to produce, and it comes to what you were saying before, it comes to producing, it's like, okay, did this person really do this? Is this, was there anybody else there helping? And we have all these things that we think, but yeah, no, that's my opinion, at least, guys. Does anybody else? I'm curious to see what others think about it.
Yeah, I would like to add to what you said, Chris, actually, like with the writing and vocabulary and then speaking, as you mentioned, because I think they're also like on a scale or a dimensional scale, because even like where I come from, like you graduate from college, you have a degree in like English literature. The moment you start writing, you write awesome. But then when you speak, as a graduate with a degree in English language, you see the gap. Like, oh, okay, your writing is higher than like your speaking skills. And I think that's also comes back to what even like the culture of the learners. Sometimes people come from more oral cultures where they speak more than they write more. And that's also plays into that, even with vocabulary. And that also comes into the vocabulary. And like also with what Michael said about dictionary, I said, I remember when I was a student in high school and I asked one of my teachers how to learn a vocabulary. And he said, open the dictionary. I was like, now I'm a teacher, like after like many years, I was like, I'm not sure the dictionary was maybe the best.
I actually have a point to make, connecting both of your comments that I'm thinking as you're saying. I think it also has to do with to what extent we focus on both grammar and vocabulary when we're teaching speaking. I think we focus so much more on grammar and vocabulary when we're teaching writing and reading than when we're teaching speaking and listening. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have that gap of, okay, people can retrieve vocabulary to write, but they cannot retrieve as fast to speak, right? Or they can recognize the vocabulary a lot in reading, but whenever they have to recognize the vocabulary in listening, right? So I think it has to do a lot with how we teach and how we test those two particular skills, those two particular aspects of language, both grammar and vocabulary, right? So, and that ties into those, in this case here, since we're talking about vocabulary, those formulaic phrases and those longer lexical items. And like you're saying, this is something that is developed over time. But why is that the case? Can we not teach students more formulaic language, or when you teach a word, you teach something that collates with it, that it's more how it is used in the real world, as opposed to, okay, a student have this knowledge of like a bunch of different isolated words, but they don't know the context, right? And so this is something like Michael was saying in the very beginning here about the importance of context in tests, right? So let's keep going here. Well, one of the reasons for this particular question and testing single items, right, single words, it's because it's easier, right, to test in vocabulary tests, right, discrete type tests. They're also easier to identify, and like going back to dictionaries and lists, right? You give students a list and then just, yeah, go ahead and memorize those, right? And it's easier to score as well. And also because larger lexical phrases can vary in grammatical form, and they have particular interactions in spoken and written discourse, right? So I think all of these reasons play a big role in why we don't assess so much larger lexical items and we focus on the isolated word, which shouldn't be the case, right? Yes, it should be the case, but we should also be bringing in larger lexical items and all these other components, no matter how hard it is for us to create the tests, right? Because it takes practice, right? To go from the traditional way of testing to creating tests that are more congruent with the new ways of teaching, right? You see a lot of different ways of teaching and communicative approach, right? And going beyond the communicative approach, but how much of that did we see reflect on our tests, right? Are we teaching this beautifully in this beautiful way, but are we testing in this beautiful way that we are teaching, right? In terms of giving more context to students and being more communicative, right?
Tahnee, can I say something real quick? Just
Sure.
that came to my mind. Something that I was thinking also is that we also have to think about the frequency that the student has, like the opportunities that he has to, use that new language that he's learning. I was kind of thinking about when a student goes to a language course 3 times a week, and then he goes back home and he's speaking his language again, like on a daily basis. Well, that's very different from somewhere or where the student goes, like for example, a student that comes to the United States or goes to Canada and he's studying at the language center, but at the same time he has contact with others outside. He speaks English, he watches movies, he watches documentaries, and I think that certainly helps with the student vocabulary acquisition, faster than if they were in their country, for example. That's just something that came to my mind.
And the difference between acquisition and learning, right? What happens naturally and what actually needs conscious effort, right?
Right.
So here are some considerations in designing assessment tasks, right? Clarify your purpose. What are you teaching, right? Well, why, no, sorry, not what, but why are you teaching? Why are you giving this test? What is the purpose? Because only that you will are going to be able to identify, okay, what is the intended use of this test and why you're giving this test? What do I want to get out of it, right? Then you define your construct, and your construct has to do with how you define word and word knowledge and what dimension you actually want to test, right? And going, of course, and considering what Abdul Samad brought up too, the spectrum and the level of the students as well. Then you're selecting your target words. And by words here, I mean lexical items, right? It could be an expression, it could be one word, it could be two words, it could be a function word, it could be a content word, it could be a high frequency word, it could be specialized vocabulary for biology, for example, right? So you have to select what your target words are. And then determine mode of performance, meaning, are you going to give them recognition tasks? Are you going to give them production tasks? Are you going to give both, right? And like I said, so there are different types of tasks, and I think there's a place for all of these tasks. I don't think we should ignore one task and just use another type of task. Now, I don't want to say, oh, let's just use communicative tasks. No, I think there is a place for all of these tasks in helping a student learn the word, right? And I can't recall where I read this, but I read it a long time ago that for you to actually learn a word, you need to see it at least 8 times or come across it at least 8 times in different ways, shape, and form, right? You have to use it, you have to listen to it, you have to read it, right? And so I think by giving and by having a variety of tasks, right, you are helping students through the process of learning, actually learning that word. And then the other, oh, go ahead.
These vocabulary, these tasks are also reflective of Bloom's taxonomy. You know, understand, remember, all the way up to the create. You know, and so yeah, this makes complete sense.
Definitely. Just like we should approach grammar as well, right? And then we have the focus on the form, but then you have meaning, right? You have the pragmatic and you have use. So you have form, you have meaning, and you have use. And I think this should apply not only to grammar, but also to vocabulary, right? And then you go step by step. And thinking of Bloom's taxonomy, I think it can be applied even if the individual is a beginner learner of the second language.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. You can take them through all the columns and all the steps in the ladder, but even if they are beginner learners of English, right? So we only have 10 minutes left, but here were some example tasks that were in the Brown and Aweki-Rama book, the chapter that I shared with you, right? And so you have some pros and cons of these types of tasks. I like them, but I try to have a mix and match of types of exercises as well, and give more context to. So I think there's a place for all of them. Like, for example, this one here, you really have to know the meaning of the word, but there's no other context to help you recognize the word, right? So you have to actually know right away what the meaning of the word deviate means, right? But how about for a vocabulary recall type of task, right? So the restaurant is so popular that you have to make a
Reservation.
so it's, and what, Abdul Samad?
Reservation?
Yeah, a call or a reservation.
Make a call, make a reservation. So you would see, and then this type of task is very particular, very tricky to score too, because you have to think, and I think for non-native speakers, teachers, it may be a little bit harder because then you start thinking, and that's what happens to me, like make a call, okay, make a reservation. I would say make a reservation right away, but then what if a student says make a call, right? Would that be okay? And then you start thinking, okay, well, is that natural? Is that not natural? Like, so vocabulary recall tasks are much trickier to grade than a vocabulary recognition like that one, right? So you have to be...
The recall also has a cultural component to it. That, you know, if you come from a place where making a reservation isn't required or part of the culture, then why would you make the reservation? You know?
And that's exactly what I come from.
Make a call.
Just show up. I mean,
yeah,
you call for important things. I mean, to reserve a table. Are you serious?
Right.
Well, guys, here in California right now, if you don't make a reservation, they're only taking 25% of people at restaurants. So it's definitely super important
yeah.
here right now, at least.
My daughter, not to get too far off, but my daughter tells me that they're now actually, if you don't keep that reservation, they're actually charging your credit card.
Oh, wow.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. In Minnesota, they are.
Oh wow, that's no bueno.
I'm glad I didn't hear that in Illinois. Not here yet. Hopefully it will not reach.
Yeah. But then why did you say reservation and not booking, right?
Hmm?
So these are things that we have to keep in mind as well, right? That's the beauty of vocabulary, too, the beauty of grammar, right? There's so many ways of saying the same thing, but then some ways are not appropriate, right? And then you have one sentence, so you give a little bit more context, right? And you have a high frequency word versus a low frequency word, right? And then I don't know about you, but writing descriptors takes me forever to think of good distractors to write that are not be going to like, oh, this is obviously incorrect or this is obviously correct, right? Because there's a problem with both situations, right? Yeah. So it's got, and I feel like writing context sentences for context, it makes it much easier to write the distractors as well. Michael, is that your experience? Like you were talking about fields, right? You were talking about context there. So when you write vocabulary tests, do you think it's easier to write tests as well when you give more context?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the tricks about this, let's look at the second one, for example. It's one of the tricks is to put the word into a context without actually defining the word. I think that second example almost falls into that, right? We almost get a definition of what hazardous is by this second part because it caused many fatal accidents. And we actually want to try to avoid defining the word in the context. So giving a good natural example without almost giving the answer away.
But I feel like for that, you need to be able to give a lot more context, right? Mm-hmm. Or like give more of it, like for example, it's part of a conversation or it's part of a paragraph. What do you think?
Well, another thing, I mean, that I do often is just to sort of turn this around is that if there's a list of vocabulary words that students are studying, I would give a sentence with a synonym or maybe a phrase that has the meaning in the sentence, and then give them in the multiple choice, in the options, give them 3 of their vocabulary words and allow them to choose which one best means that thing. So the vocabulary words actually come in the options rather than in the stem.
Okay, that's another option as well, definitely.
Yeah, and I would like to add, talking about the distractors, like the first example, the second example, I think did well with the 4 options, A, B, C, D, but in the first one, B to me is a bad distractor or choice, because in a way or another, it tricked the learner either to choose it or not to choose it, and that's not a good distractor. Whereas the other 3 are good, but B is tricky, and it shouldn't be in a quiz or a test. I mean, the quiz or a test shouldn't be tricky.
Definitely.
It's very interesting to hear all of your guys' opinions on this, because usually when I meet with the content developers at ITAP, most of the times people are saying, Chris, the one point I have problems, is when I'm creating distractors. It's always all the content developers, they talk about that all the time. So I thought it was interesting that you guys have the same opinion. And it's definitely super challenging. And sometimes we have to change things at ITAP too, guys, because we get emails from students and even from some folks from institutions telling us as well, hey, this one question was too easy, or this one question was too difficult. You guys, gotta make some tweaks in there, and that's super helpful for us as well. So that was super interesting.
And one thing that I found, I guess we can do a whole webinar on writing test items, right? But one thing that I found useful is if I have the opportunity to reuse a test, and compare like what is the percentage of people who got that option correct or who chose that option, even if it's not the correct option, right? And then you analyze the statistics of each distractor, and then you can tell, okay, if nobody's choosing that distractor, it's not a good distractor either, because then it's not a distractor, right? But if everybody is choosing the correct answer, that's not, and it means that the distractors were not good, because the distractors didn't distract anybody. Right. And so I think there's lots of things that can be said about.
Tahnee, let me just add to that real quick. And I know you're on a short time here, and but it's interesting you said that too, because our software at ITAP does actually have that feature. So we have graphs that show us all the answers and why did the student not choose this one answer, and everybody's choosing B, but the answer is A, what's going on? And that is also something that really helps us all the time to determine what's wrong, what we have to change. And so that would be definitely helpful for other types of tests as well. I don't know if other testing companies do have that feature, but we do have it, and it's super helpful for all of us.
And I think this is a feature that standardized tests use, right? They're analyzing to see, and that's why I think the TOEFL, they have a section, they're just testing, they're not even scoring the students. So to test the questions themselves. But as teachers, as classroom teachers, how often do we do that? How often do we go back to a test item and say, oh, I need to revise this? Because how often do we use exactly the same test, right? We don't have the opportunity to reuse our test as many times as a standardized test reuses the questions, right? But I think it's an analysis that is important to be done as classroom teachers as well. Even if we look at the group of tests that we have in front of us at that time, if we're not giving the test again, and I always make notes to myself, like, okay, if I give this test again, this was not a good distractor, right? Or this was not a good test item, right? There were other options here, and like we talked about in the beginning, right? Vocabulary matching exercises, and I like the idea of having fewer like options the number doesn't match, because it increases the level of difficulty, I think, right? As opposed to having 5 and 5, for example, right? And then word association, and then you have to be very careful as well when choosing the words to be associated, because what does it mean by word association, right? If you look at the word edit, are we looking at, for example, revise? Or are we looking at collocations? What do you usually edit? You edit a film, for example, you edit a text. So if a student chooses film or text, is it technically wrong? Is it not wrong? What association they're making, right? So we have to be very careful when we construct items like this as well. The same thing with team, right? When we think of team, we think of group, we think of together, but you can also have a team of sciences, right? And you also have sports teams. So what is the association that you're trying to get from your students, right? Is that the associating with the meaning? Is it association with collocations as well, right? And then fill in the blanks exercises. I'm gonna go really quick here. And then communicative tasks. And I wanted to, I can share after we finish here, I'll share you a few examples of how I incorporated vocabulary exercises into my quizzes, into my listening quizzes. And so you feel free to you look at the tasks that I have that we don't have a lot of time here so I can show, but I will share some tasks that I've created to be used for listening quizzes as well, right? And that was my last question to you. And I think we talked a little bit about it already. What are your thoughts on this limitation? Should we be bringing vocabulary teaching and testing into other skills and into other tests rather than just reading tests, for example?
Absolutely. Very
Yes.
quick answer. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I agree too.
And just, I know we're running out of time, but because, you all know that, well, some of you already know, if you were here in my last webinar, I love grammar and I love talking about assessing grammar, right? And I wrote a grammar book, 2 grammar books for Cecil. And one of the things that I told my students is that to make meaning and to make sense, right? It's not enough to know a word. You need to know the word and you need to know the grammar, right? Because, and Crystal points that out very clearly, because a word by itself may have meaning, but it will not always make sense, right? It needs grammar. So we cannot disconnect vocabulary from grammar as well, right? So for example, the word book, I bought a grammar book, here it's a noun, but then I will book a room, this is a verb. And because one is a noun, the other is a verb, here where it is in the sentence, the meaning changes completely. So we cannot disassociate one thing, right? And language, you cannot disassociate things in language, right? Everything is very interconnected. So remember to connect vocabulary with grammar, and also, like I said, vocabulary with pronunciation and grammar as well. Like for example, in the case of the 2-syllable words, that could be nouns or verbs, like object, object, present, present, right? So I think that's also a dimension of learning vocabulary too. So this is the end of our webinar number 3. I would like to first of all thank you so much for joining me today. And also our sponsor for today's webinar, which is the Istituto Americano, which I'm not pronouncing correctly again with my Italian accent. So thank you very much, the American Language Center in Italy, Istituto Americano, and thank you all for joining me today. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. This was great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.